Michael Osterlink here. I'm talking to Marc Lesser. He is the author of the new book, 7 Practices of a Mindful Leader. Marc helped develop the world-renowned Search Inside Yourself program within Google, a mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training for leaders, which teaches the art of integrating mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and business savvy for creating great corporate cultures and a better world. He founded and was CEO of 3 companies, is author of 4 books, and has an MBA degree from New York University. Marc was a resident of the San Francisco Zen Center for 10 years and director of the Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, the first Zen monastery in the Western world. How you doing, Marc?
I'm good. Good morning, Michael.
Good to see you. So first of all, I want to do a shout out to John Steiner. He was kind enough to bring your book to my attention and to make the proper introductions. So thank you for that, John. Great guy.
I'll just interject. Little known fact.
Sure.
John Steiner and I were roommates at Tassajara Zen Mountain Center a long time ago. It was actually my first practice period, first 90-day retreat, and that's how I've met John, and I've been in touch with him, over all these years. More recently, I bump into him at social venture network meetings, kind of this organization that's a cross between business and social good.
Right on. No, that's great. I did not know how far your connection with John goes back.
Way back.
I'm not surprised, and I'll just tell you a funny story on my side. I was in Ecuador many, many years ago, and I was at a cafe, and I struck up a conversation with the guy sitting at a table next to my table. He goes, "I'm from Colorado." And I said, "Do you know John Steiner?" And he did. So I think everyone in the world, to some degree, has some kind of connections with John, which is wonderful, as he's a great guy.
Yeah.
But we're here to talk about your new book, 7 Practices of a Mindful Leader. Before we do, I kind of laid out a little bit of your history. You have a lot of work within the meditation field, and you also have an MBA, and you've done a lot of business work. But fill in the gaps. What didn't I talk about that kind of led you to the life that you're now leading and what you're teaching in the world?
Yeah, I was a undergraduate at Rutgers when I kind of first caught the mindfulness bug, the started asking the questions about, like, why am I here at Rutgers, and what is my life really like, and why do I think this way, and why do I feel this way, and those questions led me to take a 1-year leave of absence from Rutgers and head to San Francisco, where at the time I joined actually it was a program connected to Sonoma State University called the Humanist Institute, was brought me to San Francisco. It was an easier sell for my parents because it was connected to a graduate program. But then it became a much harder sell when I announced that this education on the West Coast was what I needed instead of coming back to Rutgers. And I while in San Francisco, I learned of the Zen Center, and there's something really appealing to me about Zen practice and about that community in particular. And I heard of the Zen Center through the Tassajara bread book, interestingly enough, and I was really attracted by the combination of bread baking, very practical. There was some real depth to Ed Brown's words in that book, and also there was a sense of humor to it. And I was like, wow, this is I'm attracted to these things. Now, I walked into the Zen Center in the city one day, and I just immediately felt this sense of being at home, and that 1 year turned into 10 years. And totally upended and transformed, my everything in my life, and oddly enough, it also led me to be drawn to the world of leadership and work, which when I think back to when I was an undergraduate, I wouldn't have even associated with people who were business majors at the time. Business had sort of a bad rap to it. but and I think in some sense I had this kind of audacious idea of seeing what I could do to change that. A big part of my experience at the Zen Center was having leadership roles. Having, I ran the Tassajara kitchen for a year, and then I was director of Tassajara for a year. So that's, in a way, those things sort of set the table of the really profound experience of the integration of meditation practice, mindfulness practice with work and leadership, and wondering, like, why isn't everybody doing this? This makes so much sense. And it seemed like it would be so good for as a way of reducing greed, hate, and delusion in the workplace, and changing the way that corporations look like they were working and the way leadership was framed. So that kind of set my path. And business school I started a publishing company called Brush Dance. We made greeting. We were one of the first companies in the world to make greeting cards, wrapping paper out of recycled paper.
Wow.
And that was a 15-year run.
Nice.
And again, I think in some way I needed, looking back, the story I tell is that I needed to be in the CEO seat. I needed to really get that experience of what it's like running, growing a company. And then it was after that I started a coaching consulting practice, and right away found myself working with Google engineers. And it happened to be right at the time when a Google engineer wanted to start a program within Google of bringing mindfulness, meditation, emotional intelligence. And I was part of a team that created that program, Search Inside Yourself. And then I was also then part of a team that created an organization to spread that work outside of Google into other companies. And I was the CEO of the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. And that's kind of the story.
What year did you make it to San Francisco?
Early on. I'm an old guy somehow. It was 1973 that I was lucky. Actually, it's funny, as I say this, I realize how much my view of the military has changed since my wife works with veterans, and it's a very common experience for me to have Marines at my dinner table these days. But I wasn't drafted. I got a high number in the lottery, 1973, and had the luxury of being able to choose to come and spend some time on the West Coast.
Offline, I'd love to learn more what your wife does, because I also do work with vets, but we'll save that for another conversation. That sounds an important conversation for us to have.
Yeah, she's in Nashville, Tennessee right now, leading a veterans retreat.
Oh, nice. Okay. That sounds great. So 1973, you're in San Francisco. Contextualize this, because in your book you talked about, you mentioned you started out as a cook, and you eventually ran the kitchen. But contextualize it to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, that a previous, maybe a book was written by Dogen, who was by the founder of Zen in Japan, called Instructions to the Cook. And I was fascinated to read that in your book, because he talks about three different minds: the joyful mind, the grandmother mind, and the wise mind. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing to hear the lineage, like, how you are now expressing some of the earlier thinking and applying it to not only, a Zen setting, but to technology world, the tech world, the business world, more broadly. Mm-hmm. So just briefly, talk about the 700 years plus of the tradition.
Yeah, I think it's significant, especially, it's easy to think that, oh, what a novel new idea that, of mindfulness in the business world. And of course, this is something, I think even further back than 700 or 800 years ago, that in fact, this was in some way the origin of Zen practice, right? So Zen kind of emerged like in the 5th and 6th century in China,
Okay.
when the kind of mystical Buddhist tradition of India met the work-oriented, ethical-oriented, and nature-oriented Buddhism and religions of um, Confucianism and Taoism that were happening at the time in China, and work was a big part of spiritual practice. You know, there was a famous saying that emerged from that time: a day of no work is a day of no eating. Um, and but this was kind of just, you know, a saying to express that work, that it wasn't all about sitting meditation. This was a kind of a shift in how spiritual traditions were viewed. And then several hundred years later, the founder of Zen in Japan, this fellow Dogen, wrote what became a really kind of key essay, right? Instructions to the head cook, and laid out this formula for practicing, for bringing meditation practice, for bringing mindfulness practice into work, into the daily work. And as you just said, it's actually it's a beautiful, both poetic and practical essay that he wrote, worth checking out. In fact, there's some people have written books on this. I think Bernie Glassman wrote a book about this essay. And one of the highlights, though, and one of the parts that I think is kind of most easily sort of translatable into any job that you have, is to aspire to work with the mind of joy, with the mind of unconditional love. He calls it, you know, grandmother mind, and with wise mind, the mind, you know, to actually, what a amazing novel, you know, grounded idea to bring wisdom into your work as a leader, and in whatever you're doing in the work world. You know, in the Tassajara kitchen, they actually have, like, in the center of the kitchen, it says, you know, joyful mind, grandmother mind, and wise mind are there, you know, to aspire toward bringing that into one's work. Now, of course, you know, as people point out to me all the time, and I get to see it all the time, people's experience at work can be anything but joyful, loving, and wise. Right. There are those toxic environments, those toxic bosses. There's just, and even in a good environment, there's stress, there's difficulty, there's things go wrong, things fail, people lose their tempers. So I think I just want to, you know, it's not all. I'm not a. I hope I'm not a La La Land guy. That you know, that I feel like, in fact, I sometimes say, you know, that I was the CEO of a growing company for 15 years, and I have the scars to prove it. You know,
well, actually, even in your book, when you talk about running the kitchen, you talk about the stress. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like all woo-woo, lovey-dovey type. I mean, you're coming from the place of the heart, so there was lovey-dovey, but it wasn't all like, you know, slow and easy. I mean, it was very fast-paced, deadlines, people. I mean, so you are really clear in your book that you are operating in what we call VUCA environments, little chaotic environments. Yeah. And one of the ways I've read The Wise Mind is that it's about embracing change. Mm-hmm. And I've been fortunate to be a meditator since I was 9. And I must say, you know, watching the world of meditation grow from woo-woo, something only Californians do back then, you know, I'm sure other people did it too, but, you know, just kind of in the popular culture, to something like, you know, the military does it now. People in New York, you know, and on Wall Street do it. The tech companies do it, as you've already acknowledged. And I spoke Google. You worked at Google, helping them with their program. Talk to me a little about the changes in culture that you are seeing these days, and when you saw the kind of shifts occurring that allows someone like you to speak to much broader audiences.
Yeah, I think this is in a kind of a macro world change that I think there's a big shift under that we're seeing now in businesses over these last few hundred years were built, were built in a way, I don't know how consciously, maybe somewhat consciously, um, to take the humanness out of the workplace and to give it. The whole idea was that it was more like make people more like machines. This is the sense of uh, like bring what they learned into factories, the assembly line mentality, to bring that into org charts and cubicles, and when one can understand that kind of thinking, it certainly made sense. It's probably made sense, especially on the assembly lines, where just kind of just almost making people into machines. And I think that filtered into the workplaces in general. And I think very recently, I think there's now, for many reasons, um, part of it is technology, part of it is the need for collaboration and collaboration across time zones and across cultures, and the need for businesses to be more focused on creativity and people's being skillful with their intuitions and innovation processes. And I think especially at places like Google, and more companies are identifying as core practices are about collaboration and creativity, and those require building great cultures. And then when you talk about, well, what does that mean? Well, that means environments where people can thrive, where it's about how do you bring people's full humanness into the workplace that leverages the ability to achieve the kinds of results that companies want to achieve.
That's one of the many things I really appreciate about your book, is you do go into like emotional intelligence, and you talk about the 5 keys to emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-management, motivation, aligning with one's values, empathy, and social skills. And it seems to me like the EQ side of the different skill sets and capacities are now necessary in our globalized, multicultural, fast-paced world. Are a key among many different keys that are needed. But you also, you have 7 different practices. So it's not just kind of the empathy or emotional connection to another person or self-management. But before we get into your 7 practices, one thing I'd like you to kind of talk about is, you talk about the small mind, I, me, mine, future and past oriented, and the big mind, which is more open and inclusive. Talk about the 2 different minds, both psychologically, because we're a psychologically oriented culture, but also in the Zen tradition as well.
Yeah, I think that makes me again. I'm going to lean back on this Dogen fellow, who also, in the Zen tradition, somewhat famously said that his prescription for practice was that, if you want to study, if you want to really know what it means to be a full human being, you start by studying the self, right? That the study of the self, and all those things that you just named about those 5 emotional intelligence competencies, those 5 buckets, are kind of different ways of getting into learning about our own feelings, emotions, values, proclivities, our skills, and relating to other. But then he goes on to say, to study the self is to then go beyond the self. So in a way, I would say this is a way to respond to that question about studying the self. Maybe is small mind, is studying, becoming very attuned and clear to our needs, our wants, our desires, our fears, the whole world of me and ego and all of that, which is beautiful thing to really get to know it and become intimate with that. But then big mind is, in a way, going beyond the self, and again, this can be looked at as again, this gets a little paradoxical, because in some way, from the perspective of Zen, they're actually not so different. They're almost like, like two sides of one coin, so to speak. That it's seeing that everything of these things that we look at in ourselves are actually kind of extraordinary. Seeing the extraordinariness of our what we think of our small selves, when we look at them through a somewhat different lens, they become beautiful, they become extraordinary. But also there's a sense that, Zen even asks this question, and I think this is a human question about, even asking, like, well, what is consciousness? And what, how are we spinning things? In what way are we interpreting? In what way is our experience and the way we look at the world a story and interpretation?
Right.
This is kind of a big mind question. The question of this kind of questioning everything, even the very nature of how we think and how we interpret the world. And I think that asking those kinds of questions, I think, can actually help us with the first part, with getting to know ourselves. So this is I think the beautiful paradox of it's mindfulness practice.
One of the other things I really, there's many things I really appreciate about your book. It's not just theoretical. You're not just laying out, hey, here are these 7 principles, but you're also laying out practices, questions to be asked, things to think about, which is really important because, we are seemingly overwhelmed with information. Mm-hmm. And we don't need necessarily more information, although we need more information. We don't necessarily need more information that we can't turn into knowledge that turns into wisdom. Mm-hmm. So what I'd like to do is just maybe touch upon a few of the practices. Don't want to go all 7 because we want to tease the audience, because we want them to go buy your book, obviously. Let me ask you, actually, and then I'll answer my own question. Do you have maybe a favorite 1 or 2 of the 7, or one that's maybe not a favorite, one that's more in your mind today or this last week? Or
I think they're all pretty amazing, and but my leaning would be towards the first and the 7th, right? So okay. Love the work, and keep making it simpler. Yeah. And just to unpack a little bit, I think when people hear love the work, they say, yeah, I've heard that before. Like I should love the work that I'm doing. I was like, no, that's not the point here. The point here, it's a bit of I think a bit of an Aikido move, or pull the rug a little bit out from under you. When I say, to love the work, it's to love the work of mindfulness practice. It's to love this work of getting to know one's big mind and small mind, the work of cultivating more self-awareness, and the work of service, the work of helping others, and it's a reframing. It's like if you can see that is the real work, then you can do that work in no matter what job you're doing. And even if you hate your job, even if you feel stuck, then you can learn to love the stuckness.
Right.
You can learn to ask the questions. So I think one of the things that I really appreciate about this first practice, and that's hard, is that it's really easy in the work world, in subtle and not so subtle ways, to feel a bit like we're victims. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, how did I get here? Why am I in this job? And we look out, we look out at other people, then who have great jobs, or they don't have to work, or something. Why, so there's the victim mentality is very easy to seep in and to hardly even notice it. So this practice of loving the work, I think, is a kind of radical sense of taking responsibility for whatever situation we find ourselves in, however we got there. Okay, what do I do? How can I how can I bring a sense of ownership and appreciation, whatever the situation is, and learn from it. And then what actions do I need to take? If I'm feeling stuck, what do I need to do? How can I skillfully take actions, have conversations to get unstuck? So I think and this is my life. It's one thing. This is one of the things I think we always teach. What we need to learn, and over and over again. This is my own practice, and I think it's all of our practice for anyone. I think that aspires, to have as much positive influence as we can, and to find a sense of our own well-being in the midst of this totally crazy, insane, mixed up world these days.
Amen. It's interesting listening to you talk and having read your book, how interconnected all seven are, because you mentioned the seventh one is also one, maybe not one of your favorites, but one of your favorites, however you want to put it. And it's simplicity, but it's about wonder and awe. And for number one to work, you really have to have wonder and awe. Like what's, asking those deepening questions about your own experiences and experiences of people around you, especially for number five, connecting to others' pain. Mm-hmm. But in order to do that, one of my favorites, and not necessarily favorites, but one I think is important to highlight, is number two, is actually doing the work. Because it seems like in the instant gratification culture that we have here, especially in the States, we want to hack everything. We want either instant gratification or easy, quick workaround. We don't necessarily want to do the work. So you, having spent time at Google, working with their engineers, and then spreading the work beyond Google and working in other tech and business worlds, what is your experience of getting people to actually not just intellectually get it? Because I'm sure a lot of these tech guys, intellectually, they're really brilliant, can get it, what you're talking about, but actually doing the practices.
Yeah. I think one of the primary experiences that actually really surprised me and continues to surprise me in doing this work in different environments is for people to actually have the experience of listening, right? So one, again, and I think it really comes into play when you create an environment where you ask someone to just listen to another person without interrupting, without asking questions, just noticing what's the experience of listening to another person. And several things happen. One is, for most people, they realize how rarely they're actually listening. In the business world, we're almost trained. You have to come up with your own idea. You're planning what you're going to say. So people experience not listening, and the difference is visceral. People can feel it, and then I think also the experience of how listening creates a kind of connection. That there's a way that the way into actually collaborating, actually building a sense of trust starts with listening. And then I find, oddly enough, that then maybe is a doorway to people starting to listen to themselves as well. Right? That it's like, oh, I'm doing this with myself too. I'm usually I'm either too busy, or I've already reached. I know what I think. I know who I am. But to and again, this is a little bit like practice number 3. Don't be an expert.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's a little bit like, don't be an expert when it comes to who you think you are, and imagining, building that kind of sense of curiosity about other people and also about yourself.
What's another thing that's great about your book is you talk about leadership, but I don't want people to just think it's about, oh, you have to be a leader of a company, a CEO or upper level manager or something like that. This is anyone in any social setting, basically, family in their community, in their religious space, anywhere someone can step up and take a leadership role And as we would say in our own program, leadership fellowship, you play both roles, but all those skills will help you in any type of human interaction, not just in the corporate space or any kind of, in the business world. I highly recommend your book. It's a great read, and it's actually really short, which is nice, especially these days, which people have minimal ability to focus and read. But which is actually kind of funny because you're teaching mindfulness, so people actually might benefit from doing the practices while reading your book, slowing down and paying attention both to themselves as they read and the materials in your book. Where can people learn more both about your book and then your consulting firm and other projects you might be involved in?
Yeah, I can be found easily, marclesser.net. It's marclesser.net. Yeah, and these days I'm doing trainings and workshops and keynotes and coaching. Although I notice I have this serial entrepreneurship thing happening. I'm noticing, like, okay, what do I want to create next? And maybe it's I feel like this material, this 7 practices, there's a lot of legs there, a lot to be grown and built there. And at the same time, I'm find myself thinking a lot about the power of listening, and how is there a way, how can I bring that more and more to, especially to work environments.
Right on. Well, hey, Mark, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael.
Greatly appreciate your book. I definitely encourage folks to read it, 7 Practices of a Mindful Leader, and hope to talk to you again in the near future.
Look forward to it. Thanks.